It started with a question that no one wanted to ask out loud. What really goes on behind the palace walls? What happens when the people who are supposed to serve, who are supposed to keep the royal household running smoothly, start experiencing situations no one ever talks about? For nearly 20 years, she lived inside that world, seeing, hearing, and enduring things that were carefully hidden from the public eye. She was a maid, a staff member, someone whose role was to make life easier for the royals. And yet, she quickly learned that her position came with strings attached, strings she had never agreed to and could never have imagined. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Imagine walking into a job full of hope. A young woman from a small town, ready to prove herself, thinking she's entering a world of elegance, discipline, and respect. Instead, she finds herself in a maze of rules she doesn't fully understand, where every smile could hide a motive and every polite instruction might be a test. She remembers her first day vividly. The long corridors, the polished floors that reflected every step, the ornate doors that seemed to whisper secrets, and the faces of people who nodded politely but whose eyes carried a subtle warning. There was excitement, yes, but beneath it lay a quiet tension, a feeling she couldn't quite place at first. The palace, as everyone imagines it, is a place of grandeur. Crystal chandeliers, priceless paintings, perfectly manicured gardens. But behind that facade is a machine. A carefully organized, highly controlled environment where hierarchy rules above all else, and speaking out of line could cost you more than just your job. Early on, she noticed the patterns, the way certain staff members were treated differently, the way some were always summoned for tasks that seemed unusual, even unnecessary. At first, she chalked it up to experience, perhaps seniority or favoritism. She didn't know then that those patterns were the first signs of a disturbing reality, one she would soon be drawn into far more directly than anyone should ever be. What made it worse was the subtlety. Nothing happened that would be immediately identifiable as wrong. No alarms sounded. No public rules were being broken that she could point to. And yet, she knew, deep down, that the boundaries were shifting. Requests were made that seemed personal, intimate in nature, though at the time she tried to dismiss them. Who could ever question a royal? Who could ever say no? It was a question she would wrestle with constantly, a question that kept her awake at night. By the second week, she had already seen incidents that left her uneasy. A staff member called in after hours for reasons that didn't make sense. Someone asked her to perform tasks that were outside her duties, and always, there was a presence, an unspoken pressure, a silent expectation that she understood but couldn't name. She began keeping small notes, little jottings she thought she would forget. She didn't realize then that those notes would become crucial evidence of a culture that thrived on silence, secrecy, and fear. You might be asking yourself, why speak now? Why reveal this story after so many years? The answer is complicated. Fear, certainly, kept her quiet for a long time. But also, disbelief, the sense that no one would take her seriously. And then there is shame, though she has long realized now that the only shame belongs to those who violated trust, who exploited power, who made her feel unsafe in a place that should have offered stability and respect. Over time, she understood that the truth has a power of its own. And even if she waited decades, speaking out was not just necessary, it was inevitable. Here's the thing. Power in the palace is intoxicating, but it can also be dangerous. When you see it from the inside, you understand that the rules are different, that protections many of us take for granted simply do not exist. Staff members are expected to be invisible, compliant, and silent. That silence is both a shield and a trap. Those who try to step outside of it are often punished in ways that are subtle, yet devastating. Reputations, livelihoods, mental health, all at risk. And yet, for all of the fear, there are moments of courage. She found herself at one of those moments, realizing that staying silent was no longer an option. Not just for her, but for anyone who might come after her, anyone else trapped in a similar situation. As she walked those hallways night after night, she became increasingly aware of a pattern, a rhythm, almost ritualistic in nature. The knocks on her door in the late hours, the requests that seemed personal but were not meant to be ignored, the subtle warnings delivered with polite smiles. Every interaction, every glance, was layered with unspoken meaning. And yet, she had to continue performing her duties because failure was not an option. The palace has a way of making sure you understand your place. And the stakes? They were high, much higher than she ever imagined. You might be wondering, what kind of person could behave this way? The answer is complex. On the surface, charm, sophistication, and an air of authority. But underneath that surface, something more troubling, an understanding that power can be wielded with impunity. That people can be manipulated, coerced, or silenced simply because the rules of the world outside do not apply here. And she, like many before her, found herself caught in that web, unsure of how to navigate it, afraid to trust even those closest to her. Through all of this, there were moments that tested her sanity. The conflicting emotions of respect, fear, loyalty, and outrage created a storm that was difficult to navigate. She felt torn between her professional obligations and her personal safety, between the desire to survive in her role and the instinct to run. And yet, amid all of this, there was clarity, a growing recognition that she could not remain passive, that to speak out was not just an act of courage, but a necessity. And then came the night that changed everything, a night that would define the trajectory of her life and ultimately lead her to speak out. It was not the first time she had felt uneasy. It was not even the worst interaction she had endured, but it was different. Something about the timing, the context, and the escalation of behavior made it undeniable. This was no longer about subtle hints or uncomfortable requests. This was a moment that crystallized everything she had feared, everything she had tried to rationalize, and everything she had written down in secret journals. Something had to be done. And at that moment, she made a decision that would carry enormous consequences. But before we get to that, it's important to understand the context. Being a staff member in the palace is not like any other job. Rules are opaque, loyalties are tested, and the line between duty and exploitation is thin. It's a world few get to see, and even fewer survive without scars. She knew from the very beginning that this was not going to be easy. But nothing could have prepared her for the intensity of what was to come. Every day, she faced the choice: comply and stay safe, or resist and risk everything. And so, as we dive into her story, remember this: she is speaking for those who cannot, for the staff members who felt powerless, for those who were silenced, dismissed, or ignored, for anyone who has ever been trapped in a system that rewards compliance and punishes honesty. Her voice, finally heard, is a testament to courage, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of truth. She walked through the gates that first morning with a mixture of excitement and nerves. A new beginning, she told herself. A chance to prove herself in a world that had always felt slightly out of reach. She had dreamed of this job for years. The prestige, the promise of stability, the chance to work in a place that seemed larger than life, a palace where history itself whispered from the walls. She didn't yet know that the grandeur would hide layers of tension, secrecy, and behaviors that no employee should ever face. Her first impression was one of awe. The palace corridors stretched endlessly, polished floors reflecting chandeliers so brilliant they almost blinded her at first glance. The artwork, the tapestries, the gilded edges of doors and furniture. It was as though she had stepped into a living museum, a place frozen in time, yet bustling with activity behind the scenes. She imagined herself contributing to this world, being part of a team that maintained its elegance and order. She believed in service, in professionalism, in doing her best, and she wanted to do it well. But that first day, she also noticed something subtle, something she couldn't quite name. The staff moved with a certain precision, a quiet urgency. There were smiles and polite nods, but the eyes told a different story. Some were wary, guarded. Others seemed to weigh her, to measure her worth without a word spoken. She would later understand that this was the first lesson of palace life. Always observe, always measure, always be aware of what is unsaid. Her training began immediately. She was introduced to the routines, the schedules, the protocols that governed every aspect of life behind the walls. Everything was exacting. Every detail mattered. And yet, she quickly realized that while the manuals outlined duties and expectations, they didn't account for the subtle, unspoken rules that governed interactions with the royal family themselves. Those rules were learned through observation, through whispered advice from senior staff, and sometimes through uncomfortable experience. In those early days, she noticed patterns, small, almost imperceptible at first. Certain staff members were called in for tasks at odd hours. Certain corridors were avoided. And occasionally, she overheard comments that made her pause, that hinted at behaviors that were unprofessional, even alarming, but carefully concealed behind the veneer of routine. At first, she dismissed them. She told herself it was nothing, just the natural quirks of a large household. But deep down, an uneasy feeling had taken root. She remembers the first incident that made her stomach twist. It was subtle, almost innocuous, a request that seemed professional on the surface but carried an undertone that made her uncomfortable. She tried to rationalize it. Perhaps she was overthinking. She reminded herself of her role, of her responsibility to perform her duties without question. She forced a smile, complied, and tried to put it out of her mind. But that evening, as she wrote in her journal, she paused over the words. Something wasn't right. Something was off, and she didn't yet have the language to describe it. Time passed. The first week blurred into the second. She began to notice the hierarchy in a way she hadn't anticipated. Senior staff carried authority not just in their official capacity, but through unspoken influence. They knew what could be said, who could be trusted, and who would be disciplined silently. They understood the invisible rules, rules that were learned, not taught, and that kept the palace functioning like a well-oiled, if sometimes dangerous, machine. She felt herself adapting, learning to navigate these invisible structures while trying to stay true to her own sense of right and wrong. And then came the late-night knock. It was quiet, almost polite, but it made her heart skip a beat. Who could be at her door at this hour? The palace was supposed to be safe, orderly, secure. Yet here she was, startled, standing in the hallway with the polished floors stretching into shadows. She hesitated. She considered ignoring it, but something compelled her to open the door. At that moment, she had no idea that her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. That night, she began to understand that the palace was not just a workplace. It was a world governed by power dynamics that were invisible to outsiders. Compliance was expected, but it was not always a matter of duty. Sometimes, it was about survival. She realized that the more she observed, the more she could see how subtle behaviors and unspoken expectations created a web of control. Every interaction was carefully measured. Every smile, every request, carried meaning. And for someone new, the stakes were high. Her colleagues were a mixed group. Some offered quiet support, sharing stories in hushed tones, warning her about situations she should avoid. Others seemed indifferent, cautious not to draw attention, perhaps fearful themselves of crossing unseen boundaries. She began to sense that there were alliances and rivalries even among staff, complicated by personal histories and loyalty tests. It was a world within a world, a microcosm where politics, fear, and etiquette intertwined. She tried to focus on her work, throwing herself into her tasks with diligence. She reminded herself why she had taken the job: opportunity, stability, and pride in being part of something larger than herself. But the palace had a way of revealing cracks in even the strongest resolve. Every interaction, every subtle test of obedience, pushed her limits. Every late-night call, every unexpected instruction, left her questioning her own judgment. And yet, she persisted. By the end of the first month, she had learned more than she expected. She had learned about the fragility of personal safety in a world ruled by privilege, about the invisible mechanisms that enforce silence, and about the courage it took to maintain dignity under pressure. And she had learned something else, a lesson that would follow her for years. Sometimes, compliance is not agreement. Sometimes, obeying is a strategy to survive while you figure out the next step. But the lessons were just beginning. The small incidents, the subtle tests, were preludes to something far more significant. The palace was about to reveal the depth of its power, the way it could manipulate, intimidate, and control even those who were supposed to be invisible. And she, young and hopeful, would find herself at the center of a series of events that would challenge her courage, her understanding of loyalty, and her sense of justice. By the time she laid down that first night, exhausted but alert, she felt a shift. Something had changed. The palace no longer seemed just grand. It seemed alive, watching, assessing, waiting. She felt the weight of the unspoken rules pressing down, and the faint whisper of a question in her mind. How far would she have to go to survive? How much of herself would she have to surrender before she could truly understand the world she had entered? And then, just as she closed her eyes, she heard it again, that subtle, insistent knock at her door. A presence she had not expected, one that would mark the beginning of a series of experiences that no one could have prepared her for. In that instant, she realized that the palace was more than just a workplace. It was a test, a labyrinth of power and secrecy, and she, unwittingly, had stepped right into the center of it. The first boundary was subtle, almost imperceptible. She didn't recognize it at first because it arrived in a form that seemed, on the surface, harmless. A polite request, delivered with a smile, in a tone that suggested she should feel honored rather than uneasy. But deep inside, something stirred, a flicker of discomfort she couldn't ignore. She had been warned, in whispers from other staff members, to be cautious, to pay attention to the signs, to trust her instincts. And yet, when it happened, she froze. It began during a late afternoon task. She was tidying one of the private rooms, arranging linens and polishing surfaces, following the same meticulous routine she had been taught. Everything seemed ordinary, until he entered. The air changed the moment he stepped across the threshold. She felt it before she could articulate it. The subtle shift in tone, the commanding presence, the expectation that she somehow knew what he wanted without him saying it outright. The request came casually, almost offhand, yet it carried an unspoken weight. She had been trained to anticipate needs, to be proactive, to serve efficiently. But this went beyond efficiency. It was personal. It was probing. She hesitated. Her mind raced. Should she refuse? Could she refuse? Who would notice? Who would care? The rules were clear for ordinary duties, but when it came to personal matters, the lines blurred dangerously. She tried to rationalize it. Perhaps she had misunderstood. Perhaps it was a simple mistake. She obeyed, but each step she took was heavy with uncertainty. She wondered if she had crossed an invisible line simply by being in the room. Her pulse quickened. She tried to maintain her composure, to appear calm, professional, but her mind was racing with questions. Why was she being singled out? Why now? Why her? Afterward, she retreated to a quiet corner of the palace, trying to process what had happened. She replayed the encounter over and over, analyzing every word, every gesture. Something felt wrong. The feeling of unease clung to her like a shadow. She had obeyed the instructions, yes, but obedience did not erase the discomfort. It only confirmed that there was a boundary that had been crossed, a line she had never agreed to. She confided in another staff member, someone she thought she could trust. The conversation was cautious, whispered in a dim hallway, every glance over the shoulder laden with tension. The other staff member nodded knowingly, sharing a story of their own, a similar experience, years ago. You're not imagining it, they said. The signs are there, if you know where to look. But most people just pretend they don't see it, because speaking up can cost you. That was the moment she realized she was not alone. That was the moment she understood that what she had experienced was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern, a disturbing, invisible network of expectations, tests, and violations. The realization was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it meant she was not imagining her feelings, terrifying because it meant she was part of something far larger than she had anticipated. Sleep became difficult. Every creak in the hallway, every unexpected sound, made her heart race. The palace, which had seemed majestic and reassuring, now felt like a trap. She began to notice the patterns more acutely. Footsteps that echoed when they shouldn't, doors that opened and closed without explanation, subtle glances that carried meaning she could barely understand. She learned quickly that survival required constant vigilance. And then the second incident occurred. It was similar in nature, yet somehow more insistent. The first time, she could dismiss it, rationalize it, convince herself it was an anomaly. The second time, she knew she was being tested. She felt the weight of expectation pressing down on her, the silent command to comply. And comply she did, but with growing unease. Each moment chipped away at her sense of safety, her sense of certainty, and her sense of self. Her notes became more detailed. Every interaction, every unusual request, every moment of discomfort was meticulously recorded. She documented the dates, the times, the locations, the people present. She began to notice small discrepancies in instructions, subtle manipulations, and hints that she was being observed, not for her performance, but for her compliance. These notes became her anchor, the one tool she had to maintain a grip on reality. As the days passed, she began to understand the unspoken rules. Always obey, never question, never tell. And yet, she also learned that compliance did not guarantee safety. Every staff member had their own story, their own coping mechanisms. Some had left quietly, moving on to other positions or other cities. Others remained, hardened, cautious, wary of crossing invisible lines. She realized that the palace was not just a workplace, it was a testing ground. A place where loyalty, fear, and power intersected in ways few outsiders could comprehend. Questions began to form in her mind. How far would this go? How much could she endure before it became too much? Was it possible to survive and maintain her dignity, or was compromise inevitable? And most importantly, who, if anyone, could help her navigate this environment without becoming complicit in it? She attempted to share her concerns with supervisors, carefully choosing her words, masking the fear in her voice with professionalism. The responses were polite but dismissive, offering vague reassurances but no concrete solutions. The unspoken message was clear: adapt, endure, and remain silent. This reinforced her growing understanding that the palace's power dynamics extended far beyond the official hierarchy. It was a culture that thrived on secrecy, compliance, and fear. The first boundary crossed was not dramatic in the moment, but its impact lingered. It marked the beginning of a journey that would test her courage, resilience, and sense of justice. It was the first domino, a signal that the world she had entered was far more complicated, far more perilous than she had imagined. She realized that she would have to navigate these waters carefully, balancing survival with the preservation of her dignity and her principles. And then came the moment that changed everything. A late-night request, more insistent than before, accompanied by subtle intimidation. She realized, with a sinking heart, that this was no longer a question of protocol or obedience. This was a test of her compliance, her limits, and her willingness to endure. Her mind raced, weighing options, calculating risks. Every instinct told her to resist, to flee, but the consequences of defiance were unknown. She retreated to her quarters, her hands trembling as she closed the door behind her. For the first time, fear felt personal. Not just the abstract fear of breaking rules, but the visceral fear of what might happen if she said no. The palace had taught her that silence was survival, and now she understood why. The stakes were higher than she had imagined. But even in that moment of fear, a spark of determination remained. She realized that compliance did not have to equal surrender. She could endure, she could document, she could survive, and perhaps, one day, she could tell the world the truth. The first boundary had been crossed, yes, but it had also awakened something within her. The recognition that power, unchecked and unchallenged, could be dangerous, and that her voice, though small, could one day make a difference. And then, just as she was gathering her courage to move forward, she heard it, a knock at her door. Not subtle this time. Insistent, unavoidable. She froze, heart pounding, knowing that the moment she had feared was arriving. Night had a way of changing the palace. By day, it seemed majestic, orderly, controlled. By night, however, shadows grew long, corridors whispered secrets, and the polished floors reflected a different kind of tension. She had come to understand that the palace's calm, glittering surface was only part of the story. Behind closed doors, things happened that were carefully hidden from the public eye. Things that no one ever talked about. Things she was about to experience firsthand. It began subtly, almost innocuously. At first, it was small knocks on the door during odd hours. She tried to tell herself that it was a staff member needing assistance, or perhaps a routine check. But the timing, the frequency, the insistence, it didn't feel right. The air seemed heavier in the hallway, every creak magnified in the silence. She lay in bed, heart pounding, questioning whether to answer. The first few nights, she ignored it, thinking it would stop, hoping it was a misunderstanding. But hope quickly gave way to dread. One evening, around midnight, the knock came again. Louder this time, more insistent. She could feel her pulse in her ears as she hesitated. Who could it be at this hour? Her mind raced. Should she open the door? Could she ignore it? The palace was a place of strict protocol, yes, but it was also a place where authority held power beyond rules, and refusal could have consequences she couldn't yet imagine. When she finally opened the door, there was no one there, just an empty corridor bathed in dim light. She stepped out cautiously, peering down the hall, but the silence was complete. No footsteps, no shadows moving, nothing to explain the knocking. Her unease grew. Was she imagining it? Or was someone testing her? Her instincts screamed that something was wrong, yet she was still trapped in the invisible rules she had been learning: compliance, silence, observation. The next night, it happened again. This time, the knock came directly on her door, repeated, deliberate. She didn't answer immediately. She pressed her ear against the cool wood, listening. The sound of her own heartbeat filled her ears. And then, a voice, soft, almost casual, but with an undertone that made her stomach twist. "Open up," it said. That single phrase, simple as it was, carried an authority and expectation that left her frozen. She understood immediately that this was no accident. This was a deliberate act, a test. The palace had rules for daytime behavior, for routines and duties. But night belonged to those who understood how to use power in silence. She realized that her compliance during the day meant nothing when she was vulnerable, alone in her quarters. The rules changed, the power shifted, and she had no one to rely on but herself. Sleep became impossible. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of curtains, every distant sound made her jolt awake. She began keeping a small flashlight by her bed, a journal to record every incident, and a mental map of when and where footsteps echoed in her hall. She noticed patterns. Certain nights were more active, certain corridors seemed to hum with hidden movement. The palace, once a symbol of safety and order, had become a maze of anxiety and fear. She confided cautiously in a fellow maid, someone she thought she could trust. They spoke in whispers in the shadows of the laundry room, careful to avoid detection. "It's happened to me too," her colleague admitted, her voice tight with memory. "But most people ignore it. Most people pretend it's nothing. Survival is easier that way." Those words chilled her. She realized that her fear was valid, that what she was experiencing was part of a pattern, and that the culture of silence in the palace ensured that very few ever spoke out. The psychological toll was immense. She felt trapped between her professional duties and her personal safety, forced to navigate a space where authority could be wielded unpredictably. Every time the knock came, every time the shadow lingered outside her door, she had to make a choice: comply, retreat, or resist. Each choice carried risk. Each night, the stakes rose higher. And then one night, the knock came louder than ever, followed by a whisper so soft it could almost have been imagination. "You know what I expect." Her blood ran cold. She froze, barely breathing, as the full weight of what she was facing hit her. This wasn't simply a matter of protocol or etiquette. This was an abuse of power, a test of compliance, a deliberate crossing of personal boundaries that left her shaken and vulnerable. She retreated to a corner of her room, trembling, her journal clutched tightly. She began documenting everything in detail: the time, the nature of the knock, the tone of the voice, the emotional impact. Writing became a lifeline, a way to preserve her sanity and prove to herself that she was not imagining the fear, the discomfort, the violations. Each note she made was a step toward reclaiming some small measure of control in a place that seemed intent on stripping it away. Her colleagues whispered more warnings over time. "Don't let it get to you," one said. "It's how they test you. They see how far you'll go before you break." Another offered practical advice: "Keep your door locked, keep notes, stay aware." The advice was practical, yes, but also a stark reminder of the palace's darker side. There was no external oversight, no immediate recourse. The rules that applied to outsiders did not apply inside these walls. Weeks passed, and the nightly visits continued. Each one left her more on edge, more vigilant, and more determined to maintain some semblance of control. She began to recognize subtle patterns, the time, the phrasing, the way the knocks carried intent. She learned to anticipate, to prepare, to protect herself as best she could. But the stress was relentless, the fear unrelenting. It became a psychological battle, one that wore her down day by day. Through it all, she realized that endurance alone was not enough. She had to understand the system, the power dynamics, and the hidden rules. She began observing interactions throughout the palace more keenly, noticing who wielded influence behind the scenes, who protected whom, and who was complicit in silence. Knowledge became her shield. Awareness became her strategy. And her journal became her testimony, a record that could one day tell the truth when no one else would. And then, on a night she would never forget, the knock came, followed by footsteps outside her door, slow, deliberate, unrelenting. She could hear the weight of authority, the subtle assertion of power, the unspoken command that compliance was expected. Fear surged through her, stronger than ever. She realized that the palace was no longer just a workplace. It was a proving ground, a space where rules were bent and boundaries were tested, and she had become a target. As she pressed herself against the wall, heart hammering, she understood one thing. The palace would continue to push, test, and intimidate. And she had to find a way to survive. That night marked a turning point. The realization that endurance alone would not be enough, that knowledge, strategy, and courage would be necessary to navigate the darkness that lay ahead. The palace had rules, yes, but they were only half of the story. The other half, the invisible, unspoken half, was far more powerful. She quickly learned that survival in this world depended less on following written protocols and more on understanding the unspoken code, the code of silence. Speak too much, and you risked everything. Speak too little, and you risked being complicit. Every interaction, every observation, had to be measured carefully because the consequences of misstep could be devastating. It was during one quiet afternoon, while folding linens in a private wing, that she first fully grasped the weight of this culture. A colleague, someone with years of experience in the palace, pulled her aside. "Don't tell anyone what happens behind these doors," she said in a hushed tone, her eyes darting toward the corridor as though someone could hear them. "If you do, you'll regret it. People think they can speak, but no one listens. And sometimes they listen, and that's worse." Her stomach twisted. She had already experienced moments that made her uncomfortable, but this was the first time she realized the sheer scale of the system she had entered. The palace wasn't just a workplace. It was a carefully orchestrated machine designed to maintain appearances, protect reputations, and keep the truth hidden. The culture of silence wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. She observed it everywhere. Staff members who had endured far more than she had yet faced carried themselves with an air of cautious reserve. They nodded politely, smiled when appropriate, but never disclosed what they had witnessed. Their fear was palpable, yet they had adapted, becoming masters of self-preservation. She wondered how many stories she would never hear, how many truths were buried beneath the polished floors and ornate walls. The first major lesson came when she attempted to raise a concern about one of the nighttime incidents. She approached a supervisor carefully, choosing her words with extreme caution. "I'm not sure if this is appropriate," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I've noticed some unusual behavior during my shifts." The response was polite, almost rehearsed. "We trust our staff to manage routine matters," the supervisor said, avoiding eye contact. "If there is an issue, we will handle it." Handle it. Those words echoed in her mind for days. What did that mean exactly? She realized quickly that raising concerns could be dangerous. It could draw attention, provoke retaliation, or invite scrutiny in ways that were difficult to manage. Silence, she began to understand, was not just a survival tactic. It was a rule enforced by both fear and expectation. She started to watch others more closely, learning to identify the subtle signs of compliance and resistance. Certain glances, slight hesitations, even the tone of a voice conveyed volumes. Staff members who had been in the palace for decades had become adept at navigating the delicate balance. Never too bold, never too revealing, always measured. She admired their skill, but she also feared the cost. Their mastery of silence had come through experience, often at the expense of their own safety or peace of mind. The isolation was profound. She could confide in very few people, and even then, conversations were limited, cautious, coded. Trust had to be earned carefully, and betrayal, real or perceived, could have consequences that extended far beyond immediate discomfort. One wrong word, one careless disclosure, could disrupt the carefully maintained equilibrium and bring scrutiny, suspicion, or punishment. The system was designed to protect those in power and control those with less. At night, the sense of isolation grew. The knocks on her door, the shadows in the corridors, the subtle pressures of authority, all were reminders that she was alone in her experience. The culture of silence ensured that she could not seek help openly. She learned to rely on her instincts, her notes, and her ability to read situations quickly. Every moment became a test, every encounter a challenge. She realized that knowledge was not enough. She had to anticipate behavior, predict responses, and maintain composure even when her anxiety threatened to overwhelm her. The psychological toll was immense. She began to feel as though the palace itself was alive, a living organism that observed, assessed, and adjusted its behavior in response to her actions. The walls seemed to watch, the corridors echoed with unspoken commands, and even the most mundane tasks carried hidden layers of expectation. Fear became a constant companion, but she learned to channel it into vigilance, using it as a tool to navigate the dangerous terrain. Yet the culture of silence also had another, more insidious effect. It eroded empathy. Staff members became adept at masking their emotions, suppressing their instincts, and concealing their discomfort. What might have been outrage, alarm, or moral clarity was often reduced to quiet compliance, learned detachment, and careful observation. She realized that the palace demanded not just obedience but emotional control, shaping the inner world of its staff to ensure that they remained manageable. Her own emotional resilience was tested repeatedly. The nightly incidents, the subtle manipulations, the silent warnings, all combined to create an environment of tension and uncertainty. She had to navigate her own fear while maintaining the appearance of professionalism. She had to endure humiliation and discomfort while keeping meticulous records. She had to learn, almost instantly, that her survival depended on understanding the rules that were never written down. And yet, amidst the fear, a spark of resistance began to grow. She realized that while silence was expected, documentation was her shield. Each note she made, each observation she recorded, became evidence, not just for herself, but for anyone who might one day need to understand the truth. The act of writing, of preserving her experience, was her first step toward reclaiming agency in a system designed to strip it away. The more she observed, the more she understood the mechanics of the culture. Authority could be exercised subtly, coercively, even invisibly. Compliance could be demanded without a word. Fear was maintained not through overt punishment alone, but through anticipation, uncertainty, and the awareness that every action was being scrutinized. She realized that the palace operated like a carefully balanced ecosystem, where power was both fluid and absolute, and where the cost of misstep was high. And then the next escalation arrived. One night, a knock at her door was accompanied by footsteps lingering just outside. The voice, soft but commanding, called her name. She froze, heart pounding, knowing that the system she had been observing was about to assert itself in a more direct, personal way. This was no longer about observation or subtle pressure. This was about testing limits, asserting control, and reinforcing the culture of silence through fear. She retreated to her bed, trembling, clutching her journal. She realized that she had entered a world where boundaries could be violated with impunity, and where her voice, though it could be preserved in writing, had little immediate power. She understood that endurance, vigilance, and documentation were not just survival strategies. They were acts of resistance in a place designed to enforce compliance. And in that moment, she made a silent promise to herself. She would endure, she would observe, and she would record. One day, the truth would be told. One day, the culture of silence would be challenged. But first, she had to survive, navigate, and prepare for the next test. the one she knew was coming, the one that would push her further than she had ever imagined. Because in the palace, silence was not neutral. Silence was a tool, a weapon, and a trap. And she was learning, painfully and deliberately, how to survive within it, at least for now. It started as subtle, barely noticeable shifts. A glance that lingered too long. A tone that carried more weight than the words themselves. But soon, the subtlety faded, replaced by actions that could no longer be rationalized or ignored. The escalation had begun, and she could feel it creeping into every corner of her daily life. The palace, which had seemed like a grand stage of civility and decorum, was revealing a far darker undercurrent, one that she was now being forced to navigate. The first signs were almost imperceptible. Instructions that had once been routine now came with a personal edge. Tasks that had been simple became opportunities to assert control. She noticed that the timing of requests had shifted, no longer confined to the orderly rhythms of the day, but now appearing at odd hours, designed to unsettle her, test her limits. The subtle psychological pressure was relentless. She had learned to anticipate patterns, but this was different. This was intentional. This was escalation. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of tasks, she was called to attend to a matter in a private wing. The request seemed ordinary, but the manner in which it was delivered made her heart race. The interaction that followed marked a turning point. The command was no longer subtle. It was direct, personal, and invasive. The subtle tests, the casual insinuations, the minor discomforts, all had been preparatory. Now, the boundary she had fought to maintain was being challenged openly. She realized that the palace's authority was not just structural. It was psychological, designed to erode resistance slowly, methodically. Her fear was no longer abstract. It was tangible, immediate, and suffocating. In the days that followed, the pressure intensified. Nighttime knocks became more deliberate, lingering at the threshold longer, accompanied by a presence she could sense but not see. She became hyper-aware of every sound, every movement, every shadow in the palace. Sleep was increasingly impossible. Her mind replayed encounters repeatedly, analyzing, second-guessing, trying to understand where compliance ended and personal violation began. The palace had taught her to anticipate, but now anticipation could not fully prepare her. The psychological strain manifested in unexpected ways. Her appetite faltered, her focus wavered, and a sense of unease shadowed her constantly. She began documenting everything with more rigor, writing down times, descriptions, and feelings in painstaking detail. Each note was a lifeline, a tangible proof of experience in a world designed to obscure truth. Writing became her anchor, the only way to maintain a sense of control as her external environment grew increasingly unpredictable. She confided sparingly in trusted colleagues, people who had endured their own tests of compliance and had survived. Their advice was cautious: endure, observe, document. They warned her not to provoke confrontation, not to disclose too much, and to guard her own safety. Yet their empathy carried a subtle warning. The escalation was real, deliberate, and part of a broader pattern. She began to understand that her experience was not an anomaly, but a system at work, a system that used intimidation, fear, and psychological manipulation to assert control over those within its walls. By the third week of intensified incidents, she began to see the full scope of what was happening. The escalation was not random, it was deliberate. It was designed to push her limits, to erode confidence, and to ensure compliance. Every night, every unexpected knock, every lingering presence reinforced the message. Boundaries were not respected here. Obedience was expected, and resistance was discouraged, punished silently, if not overtly. One night, the escalation reached a terrifying peak. A knock came at her door unlike any before, firm, insistent, followed by footsteps pacing outside. The voice that accompanied it was commanding, inescapable, and unmistakably personal. "You know why I'm here," it said. Her body froze. Fear surged through her like a physical weight, but amidst the terror, a spark of clarity ignited. She realized that her endurance, her observations, and her documentation had prepared her, not to resist immediately, but to survive strategically. This was more than a test of compliance. It was a deliberate assertion of power, a psychological maneuver designed to ensure that her autonomy was challenged continuously. She understood now that the palace's authority extended beyond public perception, beyond rules, into the very inner lives of its staff. It controlled not just actions, but thoughts, expectations, and even emotions. Survival required vigilance, awareness, and mental fortitude as much as it required obedience. The following days were a blur of heightened tension. Tasks were assigned with implicit expectations. Casual instructions carried undertones of coercion, and nighttime visits remained unpredictable and threatening. Her mental state teetered between anxiety, hypervigilance, and determination. She began noticing subtle contradictions, instructions that conflicted, behaviors that defied logic, patterns that seemed designed to confuse and destabilize. These contradictions were part of the palace's invisible mechanism for maintaining control. Disorientation followed by compliance. She began experimenting with strategies to maintain autonomy within the system. She used her documentation as leverage over herself, keeping careful records of every interaction, every request, every moment of discomfort. She studied the movements of those around her, observing which staff members had influence, which adhered strictly to protocol, and which were skilled at navigating the culture of silence. Knowledge became her shield, awareness became her strategy, and caution became her armor. Yet even as she adapted, she understood that the escalation could not be stopped through strategy alone. It was systemic, deliberate, and relentless. The palace was a machine, and she was a small, vulnerable part of it. Resistance was possible, but dangerous. Escape was theoretically possible, but complicated by obligations, logistics, and fear. She realized that endurance alone was insufficient. She would need courage, resourcefulness, and perhaps the intervention of others, or she would be trapped in a cycle of coercion indefinitely. And then, one evening, a situation arose that shattered her sense of control completely. A late-night encounter escalated beyond subtle manipulation into a confrontation that left her shaken to the core. Her instincts screamed for flight, but the rules, the culture of silence, and the unseen consequences made hesitation inevitable. She froze, caught between fear and survival, between obedience and resistance. In that moment, she understood the full weight of escalation. It was not merely about discomfort or inconvenience. It was about asserting dominance, testing limits, eroding boundaries, and enforcing compliance through fear. Every staff member, every policy, every unspoken expectation reinforced the system, and she, newly arrived and unprotected, was now squarely in its path. Yet, amidst the fear, a resolve began to form. She realized that documenting these moments, observing patterns, and maintaining composure were not acts of submission. They were acts of survival. They were steps toward reclaiming agency in a system designed to strip it away. And she understood that telling the story, the full, unvarnished truth, might one day become not only a personal act of empowerment, but also a challenge to the very culture that had trapped her. But for now, the escalation continued, unrelenting. And as she prepared for another night, another knock, another test, she understood one undeniable fact. What had begun subtly was now unmistakably dangerous. And the palace, with all its grandeur and history, had made it clear her endurance, her courage, and her silence would be tested again in ways she could not yet predict. For weeks, she had endured the subtle tests, the whispered expectations, the nighttime intrusions, and the insidious pressure that hung over every corridor, every polished surface, every interaction. Each day, the palace reinforced its rules: obedience without question, silence without complaint, endurance without recognition. But beneath the surface, a simmering determination had begun to grow. She realized that compliance alone was no longer enough. If she did not attempt to reclaim some measure of agency, she would become just another silent observer in the palace's shadowed hierarchy. The opportunity came unexpectedly. One evening, after a long day of duties, she found herself alone in a wing of the palace rarely used by others. The corridors were quiet, the air still, the light dimmed by heavy curtains. She felt the familiar weight of fear, the echo of footsteps and the lingering tension that had become her constant companions. But this time, she carried with her a quiet resolve, a plan that had been forming for days. Her first attempt at resistance was cautious, calculated, deliberate. She knew that outright defiance could be dangerous. The consequences of refusal were unpredictable, potentially severe. Instead, she opted for subtle defiance, small acts that maintained the appearance of compliance while asserting personal boundaries. It was a delicate balance, a test of courage and strategy. Every word, every gesture, every action had to be measured, deliberate, and convincing. The moment arrived when a request came that had crossed the line from uncomfortable to unacceptable. Her instinct screamed for resistance. Her body tensed, heart pounding, adrenaline surging through her veins. For the first time, she considered saying no, not out loud, not defiantly, but firmly, with careful wording designed to assert her autonomy while minimizing risk. She rehearsed her response in her mind, imagining every possible outcome, calculating the safest path forward. When the moment came, she spoke. Her voice was steady, controlled, yet carried a firmness that had been absent before. She set boundaries, made clear her limits, and refused to comply in the way that had been demanded. The reaction was immediate. The authority that had been assumed, the power that had been silently enforced, met resistance for the first time. And the effect was startling. There was surprise, perhaps even a flicker of hesitation, as if the rules had been rewritten in that instant. For a brief moment, she felt a surge of empowerment. The act of resistance, carefully executed, gave her a sense of agency she had not felt in weeks. She realized that the palace, despite its grandeur and hierarchy, was vulnerable to a carefully considered challenge. Compliance had allowed the escalation to continue, but resistance, measured, strategic, deliberate, had the potential to change the dynamics. But empowerment came with immediate consequences. The subtle tests returned with greater intensity, the pressure mounting as if to punish her for asserting her boundaries. Nighttime intrusions grew more insistent. Instructions carried sharper undertones, and the eyes of the palace seemed to watch her more closely than ever. The system she had begun to challenge had recognized the disruption and was now responding with greater force. Resistance was possible, yes, but dangerous. Her first attempt to resist also revealed unexpected truths about the culture she inhabited. She noticed patterns in how other staff members reacted, some with silent admiration, others with cautious distancing. The unspoken message was clear: resistance was rare, dangerous, and often isolated. The palace encouraged compliance not merely through authority, but through the social pressures of silence, observation, and implicit warning. She realized that her actions, while empowering, had made her vulnerable in ways she had not fully anticipated. Despite the risks, she persisted. Each act of resistance was small, incremental, designed to maintain safety while asserting boundaries. She learned to navigate the delicate line between defiance and survival, using observation, knowledge, and careful calculation as her tools. She documented everything meticulously, recording not only incidents but also her strategies, her decisions, and the responses she elicited. Writing became both a shield and a weapon, preserving her experiences while building a record that could one day hold power over the culture of silence. The emotional impact of this attempt was profound. Fear, which had once been constant, now mingled with exhilaration, defiance, and cautious optimism. She felt the weight of her previous compliance lift slightly, replaced by a growing sense that she could, in fact, influence the system rather than be wholly subject to it. Yet this empowerment was fragile, temporary, and constantly challenged by the escalating pressure of the palace environment. And then the next incident arrived, testing her newly asserted boundaries in ways she could not have anticipated. A request came at an odd hour, one that carried all the subtle coercion of previous encounters but demanded more immediate compliance. Her response had to be swift, careful, and strategic. She could not hesitate. She could not falter. Every instinct screamed caution. Every thought raced through possibilities. She had to navigate the situation with precision. Success meant survival. Failure could mean disaster. That night, She learned another lesson about the nature of resistance within a system designed for compliance. It was not enough to assert boundaries once. Resistance had to be repeated, reinforced, and maintained consistently. Every lapse could be interpreted as weakness, every hesitation as opportunity. The palace was patient, calculating, and relentless. But she had discovered something critical. The power of her own voice, carefully wielded, could shift the dynamics in ways that compliance never could. Her first attempt to resist also illuminated the personal stakes. Compliance had preserved safety, yes, but at the cost of dignity, autonomy, and self-respect. Resistance, while dangerous, offered the possibility of reclaiming agency and asserting boundaries. She realized that survival in the palace required more than endurance. It required courage, strategy, and psychological resilience. She had to be vigilant, not only against external pressures, but also against internal doubts, fear, and self-blame. By the end of that week, she had learned to combine observation, documentation, and strategic defiance into a coherent approach. She could anticipate requests, set boundaries in advance, and maintain composure under pressure. She was not entirely safe, but she had begun to reclaim control. And with each successful act of resistance, her confidence grew, her fear became more manageable, and her determination solidified. Yet, even as she gained strength, she understood that the palace would not relent. The escalation, the tests, the pressure, all would continue, now intensified by her resistance. She knew that each act of defiance would be met with observation, scrutiny, and possibly retaliation. The system was designed to enforce compliance, and she had now entered into a subtle battle of wills. And then, the unthinkable happened. One night, the pressure crossed a line she had not anticipated. The knock at her door was accompanied by footsteps that lingered far longer than usual, by a voice that carried unmistakable authority, and by an expectation that she could not ignore. She froze, realizing that her first act of resistance had triggered a reaction, one that would force her to confront a reality far more dangerous than she had yet faced. The first attempt to resist had taught her that courage and strategy could shift dynamics, but the coming encounter would test her in ways she could not yet imagine. And as she braced herself for what was about to unfold, she understood a chilling truth. The palace did not forgive challenges lightly. The palace at night had an uncanny way of amplifying fear. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls, corridors seemed to narrow, and the silence, thick, oppressive, expectant, pressed down on her chest. After weeks of subtle tests, psychological pressure, and small acts of resistance, the escalation had reached a point where avoidance was no longer possible. Tonight, she would face it directly. The confrontation she had been dreading and, in some part, preparing for, was imminent. It began with the familiar knock. At first, it was tentative, almost polite. But as the seconds stretched, she realized that hesitation was a deliberate tactic, the kind designed to make her anxiety swell, to unsettle her, to assert psychological dominance before the confrontation had even begun. She clutched her journal tightly against her chest, a lifeline of evidence and strategy, and took a deep breath. This was no longer a test she could endure passively. When she opened the door, there was a figure standing there. Composed, authoritative, yet carrying an unmistakable tension. The air seemed to shift immediately. The usual subtle manipulations, the whispered expectations, and the psychological games converged into a moment that demanded immediate action. Her pulse raced, her palms grew sweaty, and 1,000 thoughts collided in her mind. Comply, resist, flee, or parry. Every instinct screamed caution, but every fiber of her being told her that she could not remain passive any longer. The words came first. They were calm, controlled, but loaded with implication. "You know why I'm here," the voice said. It was simple, but the meaning was unmistakable. Boundaries would be tested, expectations enforced, and her reaction scrutinized. She realized, in that instant, that the confrontation was not just about a single act or request. It was a culmination of weeks of psychological pressure, escalating challenges, and the palace's relentless assertion of authority. Her first response was to assert boundaries. She spoke carefully, deliberately, maintaining composure while making clear that she would not comply with the unacceptable demands. Her voice was steady, though her heart pounded. She articulated limits, framed her refusal in terms of professional obligations and personal dignity, and held her ground. For a brief moment, she sensed surprise, a crack in the previously unyielding assertion of authority. But the palace did not tolerate cracks easily. The reaction was immediate. The presence that had been quiet, deliberate, and controlled shifted. Subtle gestures, slight changes in tone, the almost imperceptible assertion of dominance that reminded her just how precarious her position was. She understood quickly that confrontation in this environment was never just verbal. It was a complex interplay of gestures, expectations, and psychological pressure. She felt a surge of fear, but it was accompanied by something else. A spark of empowerment. For the first time, she realized that the palace, with all its grandeur and invisible authority, could be met with strategy, courage, and careful resistance. Her previous acts of compliance had taught her the limits of silence. Her first attempt at resistance had shown her the power of assertiveness. Now, confrontation revealed that these tools could intersect in a dangerous, high-stakes dance. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Words were exchanged, subtle movements observed, and power measured in ways that went beyond spoken language. Every glance, every gesture, every pause carried meaning. She relied on every lesson she had learned: observation, anticipation, documentation, and controlled assertion. The confrontation was more than a single encounter. It was a culmination of everything the palace had taught her about authority, compliance, and survival. Her mental strategy was simple but precise. Assert boundaries without provoking retaliation, maintain composure without signaling weakness, and prepare for every possible escalation. She spoke with clarity, emphasizing limits while observing every reaction. The voice, tone, and posture of the other person were carefully noted, cataloged in her mind for future reference. Each moment was a test, each interaction a potential turning point. And then came the critical juncture. The challenge intensified, moving from subtle psychological pressure to